Welcome, everybody, to the Virtual Kant Congress. This is our 9th session, and my name is Andrew Chignell. I'm one of the coordinators, along with Luis Garcia and Karin de Boer and Z Kwanbeck. So we're all here to welcome and enjoy the panel for today, which is presented by Kant scholars from Israel on the topic of Kant's aesthetics. So we'll have 2 talks and a respondent to each talk, and the panel will be chaired by Ido Geiger of Ben-Gurion University. He'll introduce the rest of the panel, but let me just say, in addition to welcoming everybody, that we are recording this and we'll put it up on our website at some point when it's all finished, and that we will also at some point stop recording and then maybe have a little bit more informal conversation after that. So with that, I'll hand it over to Ido Geiger.
Thank you, Andrew. And can everyone hear me? All right. Good. So we'll have 2 talks, a short response by Noam Hofer, and then we'll open the informal part of the discussion. We won't go over 2 hours, but we might stop a little earlier, depending on how many questions and how lively the discussion is. So let me, without further ado, introduce Dr. Moran Godes-Recitelli, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Bar-Ilan University and a research fellow at the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Potsdam. Her primary research interest is the examination of the connection between aesthetic and ethical inquiries, the reciprocity and structural similarity in Kant and German idealism, with a particular focus on Kant's third critique. She's currently working on an account of Kant's notion of aesthetic disinterestedness and moral cultivation, and she has published numerous articles on aesthetics and morality in Kant. Her topic for today is aesthetic disinterestedness and boredom. We're all looking forward to a very interesting, non-boring talk. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Ido. And so let me first of all thank the Virtual Kant Congress organizers personally, to Andrew, Karin, Luis, and Z. I would like to thank you all for making this panel happen and for giving Kant scholars from all over the world a chance to connect. So let me just share my screen with you. Okay. Can you all, I hope you all see the screen. I tend to eliminate myself, sort of to obscure myself, not to see myself while talking in Zoom. So if there is any problem, please feel free to shout or make a sound, because I'm not seeing anything apart from my screen at the moment. So I thought I'd share a couple of topics I've been working on recently, as Ido said in the beginning, which are disinterestedness and boredom, as part of a larger project on Kant's aesthetics. So in today's talk, I'd like to explore their potential relationship in aesthetic experience. More specifically, this talk explores the disinterested nature of Kant's aesthetic pleasure in the beautiful and other mental states it entails, such as lingering, a restful contemplation, and boredom. So I proceed as follows. I'll start by talking about disinterest on the path of negation. That is, disinterest will be set against what interest is. I then look more closely at what disinterestedness entails for Kant in aesthetic judgment as a quality of the judgment. Next, I look at how lingering can be used to express disinterestedness as a conscious prolongation of a state of mind. And at last, I look at the link between the German word for lingering, which is Weilen, Verweilung, and the word for boredom, Langeweile. And based on this affinity, I wish to discuss the question of whether boredom can be compatible with the state of disinterestedness in its aesthetic sense. Okay, so let me start with the first part, which is this negative comparison between interested and disinterested pleasure. So Kant has a complex semantics of interest that is important to understand it in order to clarify his account of disinterest. I move here in the lines of Donald Crawford's suggestion that disinterested refers to a concept whose content is given by its negation, interested. So in section 2 of the Critique of the Power of Judgment, Kant argues that the satisfaction that we combine with the representation of the existence of an object is called interest. Hence, such a satisfaction always has at the same time a relation to the faculty of desire, either as its determining ground or else as necessarily interconnected with its determining ground, end of quote. According to Kant, an interest is always a concept of an object or action which has a relation to the faculty of desire. It is a cognitive representation, which is an incentive for the faculty of desire. The reference is both for rational desire as well as for empirical inclination due to some pleasure producing stimulus to possess the object or to the existence of the object. To illustrate that an interest is always connected to the existence of the object, Kant contrasts the pleasure involved in judgment of beauty with the pleasure derived from judgments of agreeableness and judgments of the good. One of the main differences is that in the latter two cases, the pleasure is bound up in one way or another with a representation of the existence of the object. Kant says the agreeable and the good both have a relation to the faculty of desire, and to this extent bring satisfaction with them, not merely the object, but also its existence. Please, end of quote. It follows that for Kant, interest is always connected with delight or satisfaction, Wohlgefallen, which Kant uses as his, let's call it, most generic term for positive pleasure. In aesthetic experience, however, Kant refers to a different, peculiar sense of pleasure, aesthetic pleasure. Its most salient feature is its being disinterested. Kant ties disinterestedness to the experience of the beautiful in the first moment of the analytic of the beautiful, when he writes, taste is the faculty for judging an object or a kind of representation through a satisfaction or dissatisfaction without any interest. The object of such satisfaction is called beautiful, end of quote. So against this, the background of what interest entails, for Kant, a disinterested pleasure is a pleasure that is not connected with desire, begehren. Let me put it this in this table. In the sense that it is neither grounded in desire nor does it produce it. And so while interested pleasure is bound up in one way or another with a representation of the existence of the object, aesthetic judgment is described as merely contemplative, namely a judgment that is indifferent with regard to the existence of the object. So basically, again, the negation of the first description. Thus, the feeling of pleasure involved in it is disinterested. Stated differently, maybe in a positive manner, in judgments of beauty, we are interested in the representation of the object regardless of whether its existence would be useful to us and regardless of whether or not we are inclined to respond to the sensuous pleasure we get from its existence. So the question is, what is pleasurable in aesthetic judgment then, being stripped of all interest? And Kant argues that as devoid of all interests, disinterested pleasure, quote, contributes nothing to cognition, but only holds the given representation in the subject up to the entire faculty of representation, of which the mind becomes conscious in the feeling of its state, end of quote. So let me enlarge this last quote for you. So notice that the two parts of this claim are mutually dependent, namely disinterestedness, by contributing nothing to cognition, actually enables one to hold the given representation in them up to the entire faculty of representation. And its effect is a state of mind in which the mind becomes conscious in the feeling of its state. But the question keeps pending, so why is this pleasurable? Or better yet, how is this pleasurable? Because it is a feeling of the subject's awareness, or so why is it pleasurable? And the answer is because it is a feeling of the subject's awareness or consciousness to a life-enhancing character. Thus, by the feeling of its state, Kant refers to the subject's feeling of life. This claim is supported by Kant's argument that in judging an object to be beautiful, what matters is what I make of this representation in myself, not how I depend on the existence of the object, end of quote. Because pure aesthetic judgment is solely grounded in the object's singular appearance and not in any further personal interests, the pleasure it gives can be characterized as genuinely disinterested. The point for our purpose is that while the disinterestedness of aesthetic pleasure involves an indifference to the existence of the object, it at the same time increases the sense of the subject's existence by furthering her feeling of being alive. To understand this, we should examine more closely on what disinterestedness entails for Kant in aesthetic judgment. So here I turn to the second part of the talk. Disinterestedness as a quality of the judgment. So Kant begins his discussion in the first moment under the overhead category of quality by stating that judgments of taste are disinterested. This means that pleasure is disinterested not as an effect or result of the judgment, but as its quality. As such, it can be argued that disinterestedness is an aspect of the pleasure on which a pure judgment of taste is grounded. From this, it follows that disinterested quality of the pleasure is a logical rather than psychological requirement of pure judgment of taste. And that is because disinterested pleasure is bound to free judgments, which is part of the very idea of aesthetic judgment in the sense that if we caught up in interest, we cannot perform aesthetic judgments. As opposed to interested pleasure that make the judgment about the object unfree, because interest is the basis that determines approval, Kant says. So this may be related to the fact that disinterested pleasure, as noted above, contributes nothing to cognition, as it is not grounded in any determinate, it's my addition concept, end of quote. Kant grounds the disinterested pleasure of beauty in a state of free harmonious play of the cognitive powers. He maintains that the disinterested aesthetic pleasure is why no other consciousness of it, and by it I mean the relation of the powers of representation to a faculty of cognition in general, is possible except through sensation, Empfindung, of the effect that consists in the facilitated play of both powers of the mind, imagination and understanding, and leavened through mutual agreement, end of quote. Here is a more compelling description of how disinterest relates to pleasure. If we previously pointed out that disinterestedness increases the sense of the subject's existence by furthering their feeling of life, we can now understand how this is achieved. So two related matters arise here. The first is the effect of the free play that is enlivened or animated through the harmony of our cognitive faculties. And the second is this free harmonious play being a state of mind, Zustand. The first matter is expressed in the consciousness of this free play between our faculties of representation, which Kant describes as a special kind of sensation. Thus, it is not a cognitive consciousness, but a felt one, or aesthetic for that matter. What we feel is expressed in the free play of our faculties. This is what the aesthetic consciousness is about. The second matter is related to this animation being consisted in a state of a free play of the faculties of cognition, end of quote, which basically means that we feel disinterested pleasure in the continuation of this mental state, namely in that we remain or linger, in Kant's terminology, in that contemplation of the beautiful. So let me now turn to the meaning of such lingering state of mind and to the significance of disinterestedness to it. So in the third moment of the analytic of the beautiful, Kant associates the feeling of disinterested pleasure with the consciousness of the aesthetic judging subject and their feeling of life. In this way, the mind becomes conscious in the feeling of its state, as we said before. Kant connects consciousness with pleasure in a general sense as the consciousness of the causality of a representation with respect to the state of the subject for maintaining it in that state. The causality described here can be associated with both agreeable and aesthetic pleasure. In the first case of the agreeable, pleasure is the awareness or feeling that the representation is causing one to remain in the state of having that representation. However, such causality can also refer to the feeling of disinterested pleasure. Kant characterizes disinterested pleasure as having an inner causality, a causality in itself, he calls it. This serves to maintain the state of the representation of the mind and the occupation of the cognitive powers without a further aim. Notice that according to Kant, any pleasure will tend towards maintaining itself, but the tendency to prolong itself is not considered an interest in his account. Instead of feeling pleasure in the interest that the object might serve for us, we find in this pleasure a causality for maintaining and thus animating our faculties of cognition. In this activity, we merely remain or linger in the contemplation of the beautiful. Kant says, we linger, Weilen, over the consideration of the beautiful because this consideration strengthens and reproduces itself, which is analogous to, yet not identical with, the way in which we linger when a charm in the representation of the object repeatedly attracts attention, where the mind is passive. So in contrast to the analysis of time and consciousness in the Critique of Pure Reason, where the representations were conceived as intuitive content in the successive flow of time, Kant focuses here on the state of a representation, Zustand der Vorstellung, which refers to the state of mind evoked by the representation. This aesthetic state of mind can be maintained by reproducing itself without any act of synthesis. Different from the synthesis of reproduction in the A edition of the first critique, where the imagination recalls a representational content that has disappeared in the succeeding moment, so the famous example of drawing a line in thought, here we have an aesthetic self-reproduction, which means a formal response to a representation that persists over a period of time. Thus, the lingering state of mind inherent in the contemplation of beauty means that the passage of time in this activity seems to stall. Stated differently, we linger in the sense of dwell in the contemplation of the beautiful, for it strengthens and reproduces itself as if time has stalled. To understand this, Kant points that this lingering state of mind is analogous to the way we linger when a charm in the representation of the object repeatedly attracts attention, where the mind is passive, the sentence in gray. A charm rise continues to please only so far as it can continuously make an impression. It captures our attention by repeatedly affecting our senses, causing us to become fixated on it. For example, gazing at the fireplace can have the same effect. And Kant clarifies that the two modes of lingering, although analogical, are still not identical. And the main difference is that in the aesthetic case, the mind is not passive, but disinterested. This means that while the second sense of lingering depends on the existence of the object and is related to the feeling of interested pleasure, lingering in the beautiful does not depend on the object's existence, but relates to a responsive mode of consciousness, which involves an attentiveness to the state of the subject, which strengthens and reproduces itself, and thus deepens itself. The ability to sustain this state of lingering is facilitated precisely by the disinterested pleasure we feel in that state, unencumbered by any particular interest or purpose that this activity may serve. The key point is that this aesthetic state of lingering is active as a state of consciousness of the merely formal purposiveness in the play of the cognitive powers of the subject, as Kant describes it. One can engage in such aesthetic consciousness precisely by being actively disinterested in other non-formal aspects of the object. So interestingly, the German for lingering, Weilen and Verweilung, resonates with the term for boredom, Langeweile, which literally means long while. This affinity between the lingering state of mind in beauty and boredom raises the question of whether boredom can be compatible with the feeling of disinterested pleasure in its aesthetic sense. So in conclusion, I would like to discuss this question. So in recent years, there has been an increased philosophical interest in boredom's relation to creative processes. However, in this talk, I would like to conclude by focusing on the spectators or the aesthetic judge's state of boredom and the type of aesthetic consciousness it may ignite through its connection to disinterestedness. So in his lectures on anthropology, Kant identifies boredom as a void of sensation. According to Kant, in a state of boredom, the mind is empty. It has no taste for anything. Nothing plagues it except empty space. Kant describes this state of mind as unbearable, and if it is constant, it can lead to weariness with life, which has even brought many to suicide. This is a quote. It is clear from these descriptions why boredom is for Kant the opposite of sensuous pleasure in its empirical sense. But what about disinterested pleasure? Interestingly, and I apologize for the game words, although he does not explicitly state this, Kant seems to equate boredom with consciousness, specifically the consciousness of our life or existence. Kant argues that if we always had enjoyment, Kurzweil, that would not benefit us at all, for we would not be conscious of our life. He further contends that with pain, we actually feel our existence. Boredom is incessant, nameless pain. Pain pain in this context does not mean displeasure, but refers to a state of complete emptiness, devoid of any content, which is experienced as aversion or repugnance to one's own existence. Thus, consciousness of our existence here means a state one wishes to escape. Kant further demonstrates how individuals obscure their consciousness of life to avoid boredom. For example, he notes that strong drinks drive away our boredom by robbing us of consciousness. Same goes for card games and smoking tobacco, which Kant describes as ways of passing the time. These activities are meant to alleviate boredom, which is defined as a prolonged period of time that seems to drag on, so time that doesn't pass. The term Langweile literally means long while. So notice the linguistic opposition between a long while or boredom and short while or enjoyment. Kant argues that to fill one's life, to enjoy oneself is thus nothing more than to feel oneself continuously driven to live the present state. This also explains the oppressive, even frightening arduousness of boredom for everyone who is attentive to his life and to time. End of quote. So to rephrase this for our purposes, we can state that we only feel our existence or life in the empirical sense when we constantly strive for new impressions or perceptions, that is, when we continuously driven to live the present state, whereas the state of consciousness of our life occurs when we dwell or linger on the present. Boredom is therefore the response to the lack of impressions or a state of rest, Ruhen, in life, as Kant sometimes calls it, when there are no interests or ends to move towards. This is different from the consciousness described in the static lingering state of mind, but despite their differences, there are some similarities between the two states. Both are essentially disinterested, quality-wise, and both can make time seem to pass more slowly. As stated, static lingering is for Kant a peculiar state of mind, such that is not passive, but rather bounds to the subject's feeling of life as an activity that strengthens and reproduces itself. This state is enabled through the subject's disinterestedness in the object. Later in the text, Kant refers to this lingering state of mind as calm contemplation, ruhige Kontemplation. The idea of calm contemplation may seem to conflict with the characterization of disinterested pleasure as vital and animating for the simple reason that the mind is at rest. However, as I argued, and Kant makes clear, a calm or lingering state of mind in beauty is not incompatible with specific powers of the mind being active. Indeed, as we have seen, aesthetic judgment demonstrates that the mind must be at rest, that is, disinterested, if we are to feel the formal purposiveness in the free play of our cognitive powers. So to link this back to boredom, and this is my conclusion, one could argue that boredom is lingering in a formal sense. It is disinterestedness per se in which the mind rests within life while being conscious of this long while. However, boredom is a painful consciousness of one state and thus can be perceived as a motivational force that prompts action to overcome it. On the other hand, lingering in beauty is disinterested pleasure that increases the movement between our faculties and consists precisely in preserving the consciousness of this state. So, although aesthetic experience is often considered the opposite of boredom, it can be argued, as I have attempted to do in this talk, that its deep connection with disinterestedness makes boredom a compelling starting point for it. And I leave you with this John Cage quote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Moran, for this very, very interesting talk. And We'll have a short response by Noam Hofer, who is an assistant professor at Bar-Ilan University. His area of specialty is Kant and early modern philosophy, and is published on Kant's on the role of regulative ideas in Kant's metaphysics, and on Kant's and Mendelssohn's proofs of the existence of God, and on other subjects as well. So take it from here, Noam.
So thank you very much, Moran, for this fascinating and not boring at all paper. I really like the suggestion that there's something in common between boredom and the aesthetic judgment, as Kant described it, as something disinterested and creates some contemplative, lingering experience. And I think it's really interesting suggestion because, like you said, we usually think of them as opposites. Aesthetic judgment is about pleasure, and boredom is something that we displeasurable. So I have a couple of thoughts which are not really about your really, I think, deep account of disinterestedness, but more about the phenomenology or the feeling of boredom and how it's related to Kant's aesthetic judgment. So my first thought is maybe a challenge to your account, and that's from one passage I find in Kant, that Kant also doesn't talk only about a feeling of boredom like he does in the anthropology, but he also has a remark in the Critique of Judgment about some things that we perceive as boring, things that induce boredom. And this seems to be kind of a negative aesthetic judgment, which might be seen as some kind of opposite to the beautiful. Although it's not usually the opposite of beauty is ugliness, which Kant also doesn't discuss a lot. But we might think that maybe also boredom is a kind of negative aesthetic judgment. We can think of that things, objects that induce boredom are those that exactly, instead of promoting the free play like beautiful object, they suppress the free play in some way. So this is a passage that I'm thinking about. I don't know if I can try to share. Yeah, I can. Okay, so you can see it now. So here Kant said that all stiff regularity, whatever approaches mathematical regularity, is of itself contrary to taste. The consideration of it affords no lasting entertainment, but rather insofar as it does not expressly have cognition or determinate practical end as its aim, it induces boredom. By contrast, that which the imagination can play in an unstudied and purposive way is always new for us, and we are never tired of looking at it. And there he criticizes Masden, who remarks that the beauties of Sumatra's become boring for him, and he would prefer a pepper garden. And Kant thinks that the opposite is true. The pepper garden will quickly become boring, unlike wild nature with its extravagant varieties. Will never be boring. Will provide us with lasting nourishment. So that's my first point. My second point is something that may be conclusion from you, or something that might follow from your account that might it's worth exploring. And actually, the last quote from John Cage might suggest exactly what I'm trying to suggest here. That maybe, if you are correct, there is some strong relation between boredom and aesthetic pleasure. Maybe in order to cultivate our taste, we also should cultivate our ability to endure boredom. So I also take another quote from the same place you quote in the anthropology. And Kant describes how cultivated people, and of course he has this racist comment about the inhabitants of the Caribbean who are never bored. So cultivated people, people of refined taste, they always try to always sustained by the appetite and even the ravenous hunger for reading ephemeral writing, a way of doing nothing, not for the sake of self-cultivation, but rather for enjoyment. So the reader's heads always remain empty and there is no fear of oversaturation. For they give the appearance of work to the busy idleness and delude themselves that it is a worthy expenditure of time, but it is no better than what the journal Des Luxus und der Modern offers to the public. So that might be the equivalent of doom scrolling that we do today to look busy and avoid boredom. But this might suggest that maybe in order to cultivate our taste and be able to enjoy fine art, we need to learn to endure boredom before the free play kicks in, like John Cage said. Otherwise, we will always seek something more stimulating, which, although it allows us to pass the time, it eventually leaves us empty. And here we can think maybe of the difference between what we call entertainment and what we might call higher forms of art, which require this effort to overcome boredom. So these are my two suggestions, and I would like to hear your thoughts about them.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much. Yeah, for this helpful comments. So let me start with your suggestion, with the second point, the one that you suggest for further discussion. So I think that in order to think about it here, we should notice that to which term of boredom we refer to. So there is the let's call it the common sense of boredom, which is our common use of getting tired of an activity or an object that we were previously engaged in or had interest in. But then there is, I think, another sense of boredom in a more formal sense that refers to the ability to be disinterested. And this sense has a tight connection to culture or cultural cultivation and sociability. And I take Kant to refer to the second sense of boredom. And in the anthropology, where you the lectures on anthropology, where you quoted, Kant has when he talks about boredom, he has the premise that individuals in the natural state cannot be bored, right? So because they are occupied with their natural needs, with the need to survive, inclination, and so forth. But so this thing that eventually you presented as a negative state, paradoxically, as we move further to live in society, it what actually enables us this our cultural cultivation and being disinterested, which enables us to live in society, enables us communicability and so forth. And eventually enables us to be bored because we have more leisure time, and that's what opens us the possibility to be bored, right? We have an access of time. And Kant claims in the passage that you quoted from in the anthropology that in order to flee this state of boredom, we need to work, right? But it's not work in the sense of productivity, but something more akin to of having a feeling of being alive, right? So Kant sometimes describes boredom as a death within life, right? So to get out of boredom is sort of a motivational force that gives us the opportunity to feel alive. I find it, even though it is not in a static context, I find it very very compelling, or very appealing to the aesthetic experience. So when you're working, you have a vital feeling, and that's what relieves you from the state of boredom, right? But you pointed out in your in the quote that you brought that this kind of fleeing for boredom can lead also to some kind of an empty pleasures, right? Of reading in journals of empirical writings, and I think that from this perspective, I think that being in a state of boredom is a good starting point, as you suggested, to a higher form of pleasure or aesthetic engagement. And so, as to the first point, so Kant refers in the quote that you brought, I think, to the autonomous of aesthetic experience, that it cannot be subsumed under determinate rules, right? It has to be a free beauty in order for us to be able to appreciate it aesthetically and not to be bored by it or something of the like, right? Otherwise, we get bored. And I think that here, in the first quote, Kant actually is referring to the common sense of boredom. So something like that natural beauty loses its charms and does not affect on our imagination to keep playing with its beautiful forms. So we basically lose interest of engaging with the object in question. Right, it tends to be a dull paper garden, for that matter. But I think that Kant is referring here more, more on the beautiful object than, whereas when I talk about boredom and try to connect it to the state of disinterestedness, I talk about the subject's state of mind. And I think that here in this passage, Kant is actually referring more to the beautiful object with a particular attention to the natural object than on the state of the subject, because he talks about the free presentation of nature and how we should perceive it in order for us to be able to experience it aesthetically. With respect to boredom, so common boredom is, boredom in the common sense is definitely the end game here. It will end the free play, but it can also regenerate the aesthetic experience altogether. And I'm thinking here, for instance, on Alice in Wonderland, right? When the starting point was for her that she was born by her sister reading a book without pictures in it, and Lewis Carroll describes it as a near-death experience, basically, but only when she is completely bored and disinterested, she is able to see the White Rabbit and enter the Wonderland or something, or enter the aesthetic experience. Yeah, so I think this is my answer.
Thank you. Good, so let's open this to the floor and any further questions. Yes, Gunther.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation that went in a direction which I would call phenomenology. And I'm always, at a methodological level, somewhat skeptical about mixing the anthropological and psychological, even in Kant, and Kant's texts and materials on that, with his work in the critiques in general, and the third critique and its attempt at an a priori aesthetics on the other side. I may be able to point my skepticism by focusing on this term lingering. In my understanding, the Kantian term here in English translation should rather be perdure rather than lingering. Lingering psychologizes and, as it were, quotidianizes, rendering quotidian this activity, where Kant has a very special and, in a term that he used throughout the talk, refined sense in mind here, perdure. And to a native German speaker, this terminology of Dauern and Weilen and Verweilen immediately recalls the famous final, or close to final lines in Faust II, published decades after Kant died, of course, that describe a significant loaded moment, not of aesthetic experience, but of human, vital experience, as verweile doch, du bist so schön. An appeal for the staying of time. So not for some kind of intratemporal manipulation between Kurzweile and Langweile, but for an entirely transformative, transfigurative moment that we typically also associate with aesthetic experience, the sisting of time. What do you think to this attempt to de-psychologize, de-anthropologize what you have been saying about boredom, trying to turn it into a more, let's say, a priori or quasi-metaphysical attitude?
First of all, thank you. I really adore your every time you give me like a gift of culture to enlarge my argument. So first of all, thank you for that. I mean, I try in my account to not to enter into psychological structures or effect, because I really am interested in the disinterestedness from the point of view of the structure, or as Kant calls it, it's the quality of the judgment itself, as I said in the second part of the talk. And what interests me, and maybe this can be more connected to the Perdure translation to lingering, is that it's also connected to the activeness of being able to stall time. So or to be disinterested. I mean, it is not a natural state. It's maybe an opposite of natural state. And you said that it's a sort of a state in which we produce the same. It's like a self-production, right? A self-production of a period of time, and it creates a sort of agony. So this is a very interesting suggestion, but and I have to think about it, because again, I'm not and this maybe has an effect of what kind of pleasure is an aesthetic pleasure, because of course it's not an enjoyment, it's not an this what Kant is referred to as Kurzweil in anthropology. It's something else. It's not an empirical pleasure. So, but at the same time, it's not something that makes us suffer, right? So it's not something that we have to as in boredom, a state to wish to escape of. But then again, being disinterested for a long time doesn't seem as something pleasurable either. So so I have to think about the psychological ramifications of this, but I think it goes also quite well with my my account, or the account that I try to to bring today.
Andrew, please.
Thanks. Thank you, Moran. That was really non-boring and stimulating. I wanted to ask about this sort of weird claim according to which if there's an interest or a need involved, then the judgment isn't free, that you mentioned and quoted some passages, because it seems to be the exact reverse of what Kant says with respect to Glaube or belief. There he says, if the evidence is overwhelming such that we just sort of find ourselves saying, you know, here's a table, here's a computer, here's a desk, that's not free. But in the act of belief, he says it's always free. There's a voluntary choice. I mean, all over the works, there's this talk of a special kind of freedom with respect to that judgment. But what's interesting and strange is that it's supposed to be based not in a perception of evidence so much as an interest or a need. So it's precisely a need. And in this case, you know, it can be a pragmatic need, or it can be a need of reason, or it can be a moral need. But the need is the basis of this then free choice. So we have a real interest, we have a need, and yet the choice is somehow free. So is there just a kind of tension between the analyses of these two kinds of judgment, where on the one, you know, in your case, needs and interests kind of mess up the freedom part, whereas on the belief side, it's the needs and the interests as opposed to objective evidence or grounds that allow us to be free.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Thanks you. Yeah, that's also very interesting connection here between Glaube and the aesthetic procedure. When Kant, when I quoted this being caught by an interest as being unfree, I referred to this Kant's suggestion, you know, not to see art while hungry, while being hungry, right? That if you caught by an empirical interest, you won't be able to appreciate aesthetically, right? We will be caught up with another, with something that will prevent you from this the free play or the lingering altogether. I think that I think that what you suggest with Glaube, it's very interesting, because there, yes, we have a need, but the need, it sort of gives us the ability to act autonomously. And I think that here there is still, I'm debating with myself. It's like the school that is referring to disinterestedness as an interest. So we have an interest of disinterestedness, right? And it's sort of I think connected to this whole aesthetic attitude school, which I'm not very sympathetic with. I mean, I'm not leaning toward. I'm not leaning to this direction because I think that when you talk about having an interest of disinterestedness, it sort of brings to the picture intentionality, which I wish to avoid. And so I think there is another case here, which is not the same case as in the Glaube. So it's another kind of unfreeness when you are caught up with interest. It's not the same as in the Glaube, which is actually sets you free, right?
I mean, maybe the differences between rational interests and other kinds of interests. So rational interests support freedom, and the other kinds of interests deny it. I mean, maybe that's the simple answer. But what's also interesting about the Glaube case is that sometimes it's motivated, he says, by the need for rest. So it's like, yes, we have this drive to speculate, and sometimes we postulate some things in part because reason needs rest, right, in a kind of systematic picture. Yeah. So you were also talking about resting, but as a kind of, yes, negative thing where you get bored. So there's just these interesting tensions between the two cases. Yeah.
Yes, yes, exactly. No, I like it. And actually, Kant talks about it like we have two opposite inclinations, right? The one towards rest and the one towards change, right? And I think that yeah, I think that that this is the point where I think that that boredom might be productive for this for the account of disinterestedness, because it can it's sort of, I think about it as a sort of a sarcastic like a Schiller style answer to Kant's aesthetics. As a like I imagine that he could write like another poem where he says sarcastically one should be, maybe Kant is saying here that one should be a bit bored while judging aesthetically, and I think it is true.
Thanks.
I think we're out of time, Fahad. Is that okay? Or is it a short question that can be answered shortly, sort of briefly? Because
it can wait. It can wait. I can
much of a
answer it.
stickler. Why don't we just go ahead and with your question and start a few minutes late? It's not. I don't think that's a big deal.
Yeah. I want to ask a clarificatory question and to see what your main claim is here. So what's the precise connection you want to establish between boredom and aesthetic judgment? Is it the condition of possibility of aesthetic judgment, or does it contribute in any other way? And yeah, so this is my first question. You seem to draw all your conclusions from 2 points. First, the etymology of the word, the affinity between the words that you find. Secondly, the temporality that boredom suggests a standstill situation, and you want to suggest that it's the same with aesthetic judgments. Yeah, if you can clarify what the precise contribution of boredom to the aesthetic judgment can be, because it can raise further questions. So one thing that strikes the mind is that Kant is up to defining the aesthetic judgment here in terms of the free play of imagination. And one might say there is an activity in contrast to lack of activity or lack of stimulation. So you might define still a state of stimulation, which is driven by the faculty of imagination, not by sensations. But there's still an activity stimulation that imagination freely drives the subject. And in that sense, it's the opposite of the boredom, as you want to define it. So yeah, I wanted to know if you want to say that boredom is the condition of possibility that gives rise to this activity, or rather it contributes in any other way.
Thank you. Well, so first of all, only if I understood you correctly, so you're saying so basically you don't need the boredom for your account because the imagination is self-motivational from this point of view, because so what is the contribution of boredom to this picture? And then you said, is it conditional for this activity? And so the answer is no. I'm not trying to coerce boredom on the aesthetic picture. Definitely not state such a strong claim that boredom condition are being disinterested. I'm just keen of the affinity that yeah, also the etymological, but not only. So as I said, boredom is something that relates to consciousness, but a certain kind of consciousness. Boredom is a rest in life, which gives us the opportunity to move forward. But but in its deeper sense, I think that that instead of being only motivational in an empirical sense, like driving us, to work, as Voltaire, would say, or driving us forward. I think if we look at it, if we examine boredom in the aesthetic sense, I think it gives us a very interesting addition to disinterestedness, because it gives us a chance to think of another instrumental, let's call it, part of the aesthetic experience. Like think about it. I don't know, if you go to I think about like natural beauty, for instance. You go to walk in the forest. I mean, so Kant would say you have to be disinterested actively in order to spot, or to stop in front of the flower and to have the engagement of your powers. But I think that if you think about it also in terms of being a little bit bored, also as a state of mind that sort of clarifies something about this disinterestedness as a quality, I think it can be helpful. So that is what I want to claim at this point. Maybe afterwards I will claim something stronger.
Great. So I think we should thank Moran and move on here. And we'll move on to our second talk by Atai Kremer, who's a PhD student at Tel Aviv University and who works on German idealism and the philosophy of technology. And his dissertation project aims to clarify key conceptual issues in the philosophical foundations of computation by relating them back to Kant's unique conception of art. Atai, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ido. And thank you, everyone, for both organizing and attending. It's obviously both sides of that are necessary. And let me just share my screen quickly so you can see the quotes. Excuse me for the toolbar that will appear above the window. It's just that if it's fully full screened, then I can't see the text, which is a problem for me. Okay, so can you see it? Can you see the thing? Yeah, okay. So my talk today will be a slightly unorthodox take on the program title, Kant's Aesthetics, as I will not present an interpretation of an aspect of Kant's theory of aesthetics. Rather, my goal will be to follow through one of the consequences of his aesthetic theory in the grander system of his thought. This can and has been done in a multitude of ways. And what I would like to focus on, particularly as my title indicates, is the importance of the body in the opus posthumum. And what motivated me to bring out this specific aspect is new kinds of speculative realism and materialisms, which have become or have garnered excitement in contemporary metaphysical discussion. What I would try to do today is to sketch out the beginning of a response from a Kantian perspective. And what I will try to argue is that to give a good Kantian account of materialism, one would have to turn also to his theory of aesthetic experience. So I'll start by talking a bit about these new kinds of materialism, and then to kind of figure this into Kant's system. So in the past 2 decades, many philosophers have found it desirable to bypass the epistemological gap, and by arguing expressly against Kant's transcendental idealism, have formulated new materialisms and realisms. Most notable among these are Quentin Meillassoux' speculative realism in his book After Finitude, and Jane Bennett's vital materialism in her book Vibrant Matter. Both believe it to be crucial, either for the sake of philosophical progress or for matters of practical philosophy, meaning political considerations, to abandon the notion of the subject as constitutive of the world of phenomena. It is therefore rather interesting to return to Kant's own views on matter and to see to what extent the scapegoating that they're involved in is justified and what the consequences of thinking about it in a different way are. Even more importantly, it becomes a philosophical question whether one can still accept the central attitude of critical philosophy and the tenets of something like transcendental idealism while maintaining a philosophically rich notion of matter. Particularly important is the relationship between materialism and practical philosophy, both because it's central to Bennett's own account of things, and because materialism has historically been associated with political philosophy. So let me just kind of quickly reconstruct Bennett's position before going on to Kant's own thinking. Bennett's account of matter draws particularly from pre-Kantian dogmatism, Spinoza in particular, and Deleuze's reading of Spinoza. Following both, for Bennett, matter is about the relationship between forces. It is not so much the innate matter, the dead, externally moved matter that is commonly identified with vulgar materialism, and in Kant's system with the matter that appears in phenomena, what is subject to the categories of the understanding, but rather a kind of vital matter. It is not matter as what is moved, but matter as movement itself. That is what is at stake in this definition. Matter as the relationship of forces is matter construed wholly dynamically, as self-moving and self-productive. It's interesting to note in this context that Deleuze formulates these ideas by leaning on the analytic of the sublime, a topic for another discussion, but just as a footnote. On Bennett's view, vital matter is the flip side of what is sometimes called, again, vulgar matter. Instead of being passive and externally determined, it is active and determining. On her view, this new materialism can completely bypass the problematic of matter as it is normally understood. It avoids determinism, which is the central problem of materialism, at least on a certain kind of philosophical view, by denying matter its external determination. And it avoids epistemological concerns by taking an ontological perspective on what matter must be. The crux of this account is that it disconnects matter from anything human. And in that sense, it is anti-anthropocentric. And this is a quote from a review article by Gamble, Hanan, and Nail, which kind of illustrates this well. So vital matter is therefore neither deterministic, deistic, naturalistic, nor epistemological. Vital matter is not something constructed by human consciousness, language, or social structures, nor is it something that enables their construction through their failure to fully capture it, but is really and actually creative in itself. Now, Bennett here is taking part in a broader movement of flat ontologies. Other thinkers that advocate for flat, non-hierarchical ontologies, like Bruno Latour and Graham Harman, are sometimes called ontological liberalists. In this kind of system, everything that is equal, or it is equally, it exists equally. It is anarchistic in the sense that it moves to abolish any hierarchy of kinds, what is taken to be a result of anthropomorphism. Any ontology that differentiates between subject and object does so asymmetrically, usually favoring the subject. So to de-anthropomorphize thought is to speak on the level of beings, referring to what the subject and object must ultimately have in common as existing things. Okay, and this view is immediately problematic from a Kantian viewpoint for two reasons. The first is that it is genuinely dogmatic in the sense that none of these thinkers give any thought to what it means to apply these concepts. That is what the domain of application of this notion of matter is. And the second is due to Kant's critique of Heilot-Zoism towards the end of the third critique. But let me stick for a second with this idea of its dogmatism. And I think this is particularly important because if we speak of matter as being something primal, active, and undetermined or fully determining, then it's not exactly clear what we're talking about. This isn't a materialism of atoms or of frying pans and chairs and tables because none of these things it does not make sense to speak about any of these things as being primal, determinative, and active. And it's also particularly interesting, these kinds of descriptions, because Kant and mostly the lineage of his thinking tends towards similar formulations about nature. And it's interesting to see that this kind of idea is developed by Kant specifically regarding matter, not organisms, as the German idealist tradition does, in the opus posthumum. So this is the goal of the talk. So while Kant avoids speaking freely and positively about what matter in itself is, he nevertheless offers us a characterization of matter in his own work on the concept, both in the metaphysical foundations of natural science and in the opus posthumum. And I think we could take this new enthusiasm about materialism as a call to re-examine this family of concepts and to see to what extent they are different and what we can learn from them. And there's an important difficulty in presenting these questions. I think not only because they are in themselves very ontological, but also because they're born out of critical philosophy's antithetical fidelities. Kant's project, the critical philosophy, is on the one hand meant to dispel the vulgar French materialism that emerged after Descartes. This comes into his own context of thinking through the pantheism dispute. But the threat of materialism is an existing threat which Kant kind of he finds armament against in critical philosophy. He writes in the second preface to the first critique, the B preface, solely by means of critique can we cut off at the very root materialism, fatalism, atheism, free thinking, lack of faith, fanaticism, and superstition. The first 4 or 5 of these being referring explicitly to this kind of vulgar materialism. On the other hand, the critical project is aimed almost directly at rescuing the notion of physical necessity, necessity in the world of phenomena, from the jaws of a Humean skepticism. That is, to ground the human understanding of natural laws in their analysis and critique a priori. Thus, critical philosophy is in want of an account of Newtonian matter. This concept of matter refers not to what is subject to the kinds of natural law that Kant is looking to grant. The matter to the forms of the categories of the understanding is indispensable for a critical account of the categories. So on the one hand, Kant has to defend against materialism, and on the other, to justify a kind of better, more reified version of materialism. Kant himself was wholly aware of this dual commitment, and this is why he takes on, in parallel to the critical project, both the metaphysical foundations and what turns out to become the opus posthumum. Kant's own understanding of this necessity has intimately to do with the unity of his own system. On his view, the completeness of a philosophical system is a matter of ushering us out of metaphysics. A complete metaphysics would be a metaphysics that leads us into physics. So it doesn't just have to justify it, it has to kind of enclose itself completely and allow us to move on from metaphysical considerations. This is a view that he develops after the third critique and in kind of private correspondence, or it shows in private correspondence about the opus posthumum, which is an unfinished project. So, for example, he writes to Kieswetter, a student of his, quote, "The transition from metaphysical foundations of natural science to physics must not be left out of the system. With that work, the task of the critical philosophy will be complete, and a gap that now stands open will be filled." The gap between natural science and metaphysics concerned Kant, again, before the third critique, in the metaphysical foundations. There, he produces a general concept of matter, and he does this by a careful explication of what is entailed in the categories of the understanding. His aim in the book is to give metaphysical ground for the natural sciences, that is, to account for the pure conceptual component by way of the architectonics of cognition more generally, that is, what is presented in the first critique. This is a requirement on his view of physics, so that it might be properly a science. And this is the following quote, the top one: "All proper natural science therefore requires a pure part, on which the apodictic certainty that reasons seeks therein can be based." I guess there's a mistake there. Properly so-called natural science presupposes, in the first place, metaphysics of nature. Now, the theory of matter, in the metaphysical foundations, has 4 aspects in keeping with the tables of the category of the understanding. So, yeah. So there is what he calls phronomy, which is the laws of motion, which has to do with the quantity of motion, that table of the categories. The second, corresponding to quality, he calls dynamics, which has to do with, this is the second quote, dynamics takes into consideration motion as belonging to the quality of matter under the name of an original moving force. Third, there is the relationships of motions, which he calls mechanics. And finally, there is the modality of motion, which he terms phenomenology. The revision and continuation of this problematic in the opus posthumum was motivated by 2 points. The first has to do with the progress Kant made in the third critique. That is, his thinking about critique has changed between or after the metaphysical foundations. And so what he does in the metaphysical foundations is in want of revision. And the second is a particular problem in the conceptualization of the metaphysical foundations. That is not just the progress made in critical philosophy. These two are intimately related, but I would like to relay this problematic through the problem in the metaphysical foundations. Now, this problem is specifically to do with the specification of matter. Because his thinking in the metaphysical foundations provides only a very general concept of matter, he finds that he can't ground the concept of specific matters. That is what makes wood different from metal, for example. And this level of specification can only be granted when something like the principle of the specification of nature is metaphysically grounded. So we need something like the developments of the third critique in order to ground this idea. And there's a kind of circular reasoning when he tries to bring out the specificity of matters in the metaphysical foundations. So the mode of material individuation is what is unclear in the metaphysical foundations. And this is a problem with, this is an analogous problem to the problem more generally with the categories, that they don't allow for contingent particular natural forms. And in order to account for these in the natural sciences, or as a metaphysical ground for the natural sciences, one has to rethink a principle of specification. So in the opus, he writes, again, this is the same idea, that the transition to physics cannot lie in the metaphysical foundations, which treat attraction, repulsion, and the relationships there between. For these furnish no specific forces, of which one could know whether they exist in nature or whether their existence be demonstrable. In this transition to physics, there is also that from matter to the formation of bodies. And this is the problem that he takes on, or one of the problems that he takes on in the opus posthumum. And there, the figure of the human body, the subject's body, emerges in an interesting way. So what is at stake in filling the gap of the transition is not a general conceptual framework of natural science, but the unity in specification that is required of nature for a complete theoretical account to be possible. This criterion is born out of the considerations of the third critique. The systematic unity of specific empirical laws only fully comes into view there. The purposiveness of nature, guaranteed by the demands of the faculty of judgment in its reflective mode, has to do with the unity of specific empirical laws. It is the way in which natural laws hang together to form a natural space of meaning. In particular, this feature of nature first emerges in the analytic of the beautiful, where natural beauty is taken to reveal the technique of nature, whereby it is individuated into particular forms. This is where the aesthetic experience becomes important. The way that this unity in particularity is grasped by the subject is through aesthetic judgments. The particularization of natural law is thus dependent on the faculty of feeling, that is, on the way we are affected by nature. This conceptual complex, unique to the third critique, is entirely absent from the metaphysical foundations, and so the account that is presented there is in want of an affection of the subject by nature as an epistemological anchor for the theory of matter. Having been developed before the third critique, the metaphysical foundations is structurally incomplete. It can't get far enough to suffice, it can't provide a sufficient account for matter, as it cannot account for specific forms of matter, because it is restricted to the explication of the table of the categories. The categories being constitutive cannot furnish one with an account of the specification of forms, only with the conditions of possibility. Specification of forms is, by necessity, a matter of the regulation of thinking rather than the necessary conditions of it. While Kant was aware of this already in the first critique, this is developed in the appendix to the dialectic of pure reason, the conceptual devices required for it are only developed later on. If Kant were to try and theorize explicitly the particular natural forces, that would necessarily be dogmatic, as it would leap over the transcendental frame. We cannot treat the specification of matters as something constitutive. That would be to kind of gain too much of the internals of matter without justifying it epistemologically. However, the third critique's more developed account of judgment that places the subject in the midst of the harmony of particular natural forms, allowing for an epistemologically well-grounded account of specific forms, to the extent that the faculty of desire holds them to a systematic natural unity. The mode of empirical specification that the full concept of matter would require is granted only by a theory of an affected subject. This leads not to the body in general, that is, the material body generally construed, but to the subject's body in particular, as a kind of Archimedean point through which we can gain something about matter more generally. Taking the body of the subject as an anchor point for matter runs counter to Bennett and, again, the rest of the speculative materialists' line of thinking in a kind of subtle way. So Bennett does include the body in her list of what vibrant matter is. This is the quote from her introduction. This vibrant matter is my body, but also the bodies of Baltimore litter, Prometheus's chains, Darwin's worms, and so on. I think in Kantian spirit, we can reply that, again, because of the requirement of the specification of nature given through aesthetic experience, that my body should be granted some particular importance here. That is, on her view, the body is not unique in the theory of matter. It's just one of the bodies. But through critical philosophy, we would have to say that the body that belongs to the cognizing subject is specifically important and does serve a particular role not shared generally by other material bodies. That is, following Kant contra Bennett, I suggest that grounding a view of matter must necessarily proceed through the body of the thinking subject, as it links actual matter to the concept of matter. Nature is not related to empirical concepts by correspondence in this kind of view, correlation, or even constitution. Rather, the empirical concepts of nature have to do with the way in which subjectivity is enlivened by nature. The play of the faculties that natural beauty creates and the role of the faculty of desire therein introduces constraints on empirical concepts, namely that they lend themselves to a purposive, systematically unified nature. The body is thus the paradigm of matter. It is its exemplar. It is a concept of matter that is inherently affected, and one of which we have a concept a priori without needing to turn to empirical study. It thus grounds the specificity of material concepts. And it is in this context that we should understand the following quote. And this is kind of a long quote, and I hope I can do some elucidation for it. So I'll just leave it on while I discuss it. I'll read it first. The idea of organic bodies is indirectly contained a priori in that of a composite of moving forces, in which the concept of a real whole necessarily precedes its parts, which can only be thought by the concept of a combination according to purposes. How can we include such bodies with such moving forces in the general classification according to a priori principles? Because man is conscious of himself as a self-moving machine, without being able to further understand such a possibility, he can and is entitled to introduce a priori organic moving forces of bodies in the classification of bodies in general, although only indirectly, according to the analogy with the moving force of a body as a machine. He must, however, generalize the concept of vital force and of the excitability of matter in his own self by the faculty of desire. This is a rather dense paragraph, so I'll try to be kind of careful in talking about it. Kant is concerned with justifying the use a priori of moving forces in the concept of matter. This again refers to the repulsive and attractive forces which he considers to be constitutive of material bodies. His first claim is that such a notion of matter implicitly or indirectly contains the notion of an organic body. This is because the moving forces active in the composition of matter are of specific qualities and must work together in a purposive organization. That is, they themselves are contingent, but must allow a systematic view if the body as a whole is possible. The different forces must cooperate so as to yield a unified body. The interplay is structured around the purposive unity of the material body as a whole. We can discern the resemblance to Kant's comments on the purposiveness of nature as a whole in the third critique. This brings us to a more difficult problem. not only do we have to justify the use of attractive and repulsive forces in grounding matter, but also their organic cooperation. That is, we do not have to justify inanimate matter or even dynamical matter, but the full metaphysical baggage of living matter. How can one justify living matter a priori, if not by appeal to... It seems that one should justify such a concept of matter by appeal to empirical fact, but Kant seems to require that we do so a priori. And I think the brilliant turn in Kant's thinking here is the idea of the human body, that the body of the thinking subject is such an a priori concept of living matter. And this is reflected in the transcendental frame by the faculty of desire. That is, the mode in which we are affected is the presence of the body as something within the constitutive and regulative frame of the thinking subject. What is required for the conception of bodies is supplied by the subject's experience of self-subsisting natural beauty. The context of this in the third critique is much too long for me to discuss significantly, but I would like to quote something about the idea of a technique of nature. So this is the following quote. The self-sufficient beauty of nature reveals to us a technique of nature, which makes it possible to represent it as a system in accordance with laws, the principle of which we do not encounter anywhere in our entire faculty of understanding. Again, this would be the problem with the account in the metaphysical foundations, which remains only with the faculty of the understanding. Namely, the purposiveness with respect to the use of the power of judgment in regard to appearances, so that this must be judged as belonging not merely to nature in its purposeless mechanism, but also to the analogy with art. Thus, it can actually expand not our cognition of natural objects, but our concept of nature, namely as mere mechanism, into the concept of nature as art, which invites profound investigations into the possibility of such a form. The analogy of nature and art, which is crucial for the third critique, expands the concept of nature beyond mere mechanism. And it is thus a necessary requirement for our notion of ourselves as self-conscious machines. I'm quoting again from the previous quote in the Opus Posthumum. In the same way that natural beauty procures for us a sense of the artistry that belongs to the natural world, a sense that nature as a totality fashions itself by way of a technique unique to itself, it also provides us with a sense of how we ourselves are such fashioned beings, how the manifestation of our subjectivity in the world is grounded in the body, itself a kind of machinery. The primality of the organic body means that when the technique of nature is made manifest to us in the specification of forms, what was thought to be merely mechanical shows that it too is grounded in such organic specification, and that matter enjoys the light of that technique of nature too. Kant first discusses the technique of nature in following terms. I think I won't read the quote, but just so you have it in front of you. Okay, so continuing the role of the technique of nature as a feature of reflective judgment, and thus the mediation between nature and freedom, the concept of the body serves Kant in holding together practical and theoretical concerns. On the one hand, in the Opus Posthumum, Kant maintains that the unconditional unity of space and time as forms of intuition, rather than concepts, is grounded in an unconditional act in which the subject posits itself as something given. That is, there is a theoretical act, something that grounds the theoretical structure of cognition. This is rather reminiscent of Fichte. As he puts it, this is another quote, the first act of knowledge is the verb I am, for I, as subject, am an object to myself. The subject's self-positing involves the spontaneous activity of receptivity. One must actively place oneself in the position from which one can receive something. The extent to which subjectivity is grounded in such an act is the extent to which the subject exists in itself. Such an account of in-itselfness affects basically the whole structure of how we think about critical philosophy. It should make us rethink our in-itselfness and the thing in itselfness. Both the subject and the thing itself are not things in appearance, but principles or ideas, and they are taken together, at least in the Opus Posthumum, as what absolutizes the world of phenomena. Thus, there is a commonality of the subject's body and the matter of the thing itself. One gathers the character of absolute active subjectivity with the concept of the body, which one can find reflected in the thing itself, can be posited just as the thing itself posits itself as given. So to speak, behind phenomena. The body is the ground level of existence. It is the measure of what is real. For phenomena to be present in any real sense, they must be reflected in the same active positing that subjectivity involves itself in. And Kant then, well, not then, but there's this beautiful passage from the Opus Posthumum, which I think kind of ties everything together, but I don't have a very convincing, fully detailed reading of, so I'll just read it to you and hopefully we can make something of this. So someone said that the most beautiful statues are already present in the block of marble. It is only necessary to remove parts of it, etc. That is, one can represent through imagination the statue within the sculptor really inserts it. It is only the appearance of a body. Space and time are products, primitive products of our own imagination, hence self-created intuitions, inasmuch as the subject affects itself and is thereby appearance, not thing in itself. The material element, the thing in itself, is X, the mere representation of one's own activity. The analogy with the beautiful statue seems important, right? We wouldn't say of just any old block of clay, even if it clearly shows marks of having been consciously fashioned into something, that it seems like it already existed in the block, right? So I think he's making reference here to an idea, again, from the third critique, that natural art or that a beautiful art seems natural. So it seems as if it was already contained within the block of marble. But there's an analogy here with this thing which is already within the phenomenon, and is kind of sculpted out in an action, kind of made to reveal itself. And I think this captures, or this is a way in which Kant tries to capture the relationship between the in-itselfness of the subject and the in-itselfness of the thing itself. That in positing its own existence, the subject can kind of sculpt into reality the phenomena, or it can sense what is properly unconditional about phenomena. Yeah, I think this is where I'll okay, no, so actually, no, but just a couple of more things, sorry. So matter here would be the image of the subject, because the subject can only be subject to the extent that it is itself matter. This is the role of the body in self-positing. There is first matter as an act, which is the organic material body of the subject, and it corresponds to self-positing. And then matter appears as the object of the subject perception, reflecting in concreto a passive organization of active forces. And if we put it kind of formulaically, we could say that matter is what the body demands of perception, right? What we would demand in order to make what appears to us into absolute. And it does so by a reflection through the faculty of desire. Thus, the grounding act in which the subject posits itself and the thing itself, thereby making and recognizing the real in the same act, is a practical matter. This is not a theoretical question, but rather concerns the primality of practice over theory, of action over thought. The primality of positing is a theme carried out through Kant's more thoroughly read corpus, as well as through post-Kantian idealism and romanticism. The centrality of the body in the opus gives a new perspective on this familiar theme. It is not merely another variation on it, but a reimagining of how we are to think the primality of practice. Action never exists in a vacuum for Kant. It always involves a community, and that community is a sine qua non for thinking. This is reflected in his perspective on matter here by the centrality of the body, because the body for him exists in a corporal community, in a chaos of forces that arise before it and always presuppose it. That is, a self-positing subject always does so in a material and spiritual community. And this is another kind of nice quote, I think. Do you think it's in the presentation? Yeah. An immaterial moving principle in an organic body is its soul. One can assume of it that it builds its own body and even that body's dwelling place. And that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, yes. Well, many questions. Okay, I'll start from my left and go and proceed.
Sorry, I also had heard
Oh,
some comments,
sorry,
but if you
No, sorry.
I think might be more interesting to hear the other questions, but
No,
so
sorry,
I'll try to keep it short.
Sorry,
So thank you, Atai, for a really fascinating paper. But first, I have to admit I don't know anything about the works of these speculative realists and particularly Jane Bennett. And also, I haven't yet had the opportunity to study seriously the Opus Posthumum. But still, I found many intriguing questions worth discussing in your paper. So I'll first offer some short outline of what you're doing, and correct me if I'm wrong. So you mentioned the speculative realists, that they claim that they have a richer notion of matter than the traditional vulgar notion of matter. And then you want to show that Kant is also offering a rich notion which they ignore, which is worth considering. And you begin with the metaphysical foundation of natural science, which discusses only the most general concept of matter, which is applicable in physics, but does not provide a concept of matter that has specific particular forms. And then the critique of the powerful judgment makes an improvement through the principle of purposiveness, of the system of empirical kinds and laws. And this turns out to rest on aesthetic judgment, which also is a kind of unique feeling of a living body. And then you claim that the opus posthumum makes this explicit by grounding the notion of organic matter on the self-positing of the embodied subject. So I assume that this paper is part of a bigger project. So I have some general thoughts that might be an opportunity for you to elaborate on the context of your project. First, I'm wondering that something I really just point of curiosity, what draws you to the works of Jane Bennett and the other speculative realists? Do you think they are onto something, a real problem that Kant's opus posthumum maybe also is trying to solve? And of course, like you mentioned, that they label themselves as realists and they reject any form of idealism, whether Kantian or post-Kantian. So do you intend just to refute them because they ignore the Kantian question of how is metaphysics possible? Or do you think that there is something specific about the problems that they're trying to solve that maybe points back to Kantian idealism of the mature Kantian idealism of the opus posthumum? So that's my first question. My second question is also a very big and general question about how do you approach reading the opus posthumum? So some readers think that label it as a kind of a post-critical project, which might be closer to what comes after Kant. You mentioned Fichte and Schelling did in different ways. Or do you take what Kant was himself trying to do, a transition project from metaphysics to physics? So there is, you give the long quote from the opus posthumum, and which makes me wonder about this. So the critique of the power of judgment, Kant rejects what he calls hylozoism or vitalism as a plain contradiction. For example, he says matter is essentially inert, therefore living matter is a contradiction, and because hylozoism endows matter as a mere matter with a property that contradicts its essence. And actually, Jane Bennett quotes this in a book. So I can show this quote. So that's here in where he says that about what he said about hylozoism, and also later about the concept of living matter. It's also a contradiction because inertia, being inert, is part of the essence of matter. So do you think that the opus posthumum is something that offers a new concept of matter? Because like at the end of you quote it, you generalize the concept of vital force and the excitability of matter in its own self by the faculty of desire. Just a minute.
What?
Sorry, just a minute.
Should I answer the question?
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be back soon.
Yeah, okay.
Probably the barbarian hordes at the door. The small barbarian hordes.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yeah, that was my final question. Do you think that the opus postmum offers a new conception of matter in which maybe organic matter is more fundamental than inorganic matter? Because also with the opus postmum, Kant makes this distinction between organic matter or inorganic matter. So yeah, these are my questions.
Okay, thank you. I realized while reading the paper that it was kind of more dense and less clear than I had originally imagined it to be. So this is a good opportunity to clarify some things which are important. I think the turn to these kinds of speculative modes, or speculative materialisms, is motivated by a kind of double reaction to reading these kinds of texts. First, that I do think they're kind of onto something in a sense. I get the philosophical intuition that leads one towards materialism, and I think with some very pressing tendencies of world history, materialism is important as a philosophical position. And I'm thinking specifically about the influence of technology and about climate crisis. And these are the kinds of directions in which these thinkers go. So I think it is beneficial to go with them. And on the other hand, I am left with a kind of knee-jerk critical response of, well, but what about these concepts? I don't know. What about the realm of possible experience? How could you talk about things kind of from within? How does that make sense? And I think the kind of the notion of matter that Kant develops in the Opus Posthumum is very delicate and very interesting, and it provides us with a way of thinking about these things that I do think are important in a much more subtle way, and I think we can gain a lot from his perspective in those later texts. And the question about where this fits in the kind of grander corpus of Kant's writings is very good. I can't say that I've made up my mind. You hear people go in many different directions about how to fit it in. I do tend to reject the idea that he's kind of moving beyond critical philosophy altogether, but also to reject the idea that that nothing's happened, that he's kind of re-expressing the same thoughts. And so I don't think he's backpedaling, for example, about his critique of hylozoism. He's not retracting that. But he's proposing this kind of difficult idea to think that the notion of an organism is ontologically prior to the notion of a material body. And this is not to say that body is not inert. Bodies will be inert. Matter is inert. But that in order to conceive of inert bodies, we must kind of have in the background of our thinking a notion of an organism. And I don't know what the consequences of this idea are fully, but I find it very fascinating. I'm kind of this was a first foray into making sense of that.
Thank you very much.
Good. So, Monica, would you like to start?
Yeah. Thank you for your exposition, and mainly for saying that the body is a paradigm of matter. Through the idea of corporeality presented in Opus Posthumum, the concepts of matter, of substance are rearranged. We can properly speak of a new concept of matter in the Opus Posthumum, but we have to go back to the critique where the concepts of matter and substance were different. In the fundamental principle of natural science, matter and substance are put together. And Kant says that matter is substance and substance is matter, and all parts of matter are substances, and vice versa. All parts of substance are matter. For which reason he divided the both first, and after that he united them. The problem is, the solution is in this critical work written in between the two editions of the critique. because here Kant says that the metaphysics of nature is formed the corporeal nature and the thinking I, and the corporeal nature, the metaphysics of corporeality, that is the metaphysics of corporeality, is the main part, because he gives us an intuition, an external intuition, according to which we can have knowledge. But the thinking I, cannot, for the thinking I, it is impossible to give us an outer intuition, just an inner intuition. And based on this idea, we understand why in the critique of pure reason, Kant didn't unite matter and substance, because he criticizes rational psychology and presenting the psychological paralogism. Then the thinking I is not matter, is a substance. Due to this difference between the both, he cannot unite matter with substance. But in the fundamental metaphysics of natural science, he could, because the metaphysics of corporeality, he shows us that the metaphysics of corporeality as presented by the Kramer is the main part of it. It put it aside the thinking I, because the thinking I is just an annex to the metaphysics of nature. Then the ground part, the main part, is just a corporeality. And for this reason, we can, this view, this point of view is a bridge between the metaphysics of natural science and the opus posthumum, I see. And in this way, and it is not the matter is the opus posthumum of a new concept of matter, but a rearrangement of the old concept of matter, the concept as presented in the critique of pure reason, and somewhere in Prolegomena. So thank you very much for your exposition and for the synthesis you have done through the opus posthumum.
Thank you. It's good. I mean, it's a very useful note you made. I didn't think of it in the context of the paralogism of rational psychology with the idea of substance being changed. And in my reading of it currently, the idea of an act is very important. So this really kind of ties some things together. So thank you.
So substance plays a part in the thinking I as well, because it's the main category of the thinking I. But the set of categories of corporeality and of the thinking I are different and more useful as that of the thinking, of the corporeality. All because the system of transcendental idealism, space and time of all the main concept I explained through the categories of the corporeality, not of the thinking I. The thinking I plays a minor part and its categories. Thank you.
Günther, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation that brought in these contemporary developments and also constructed a Kantian reply to them. I would like to raise 2 points that might further help us distinguish Kant's position here from these materialist initiatives. You referred again and again to idealism, Kant's idealism, generally transcendental idealism, but you did not specifically refer to another aspect of the transcendental, the rendering possible of experience aspect, rather than the somewhat reductively sounding idealist aspect. And I wonder there if the distinction that Kant makes prior to the opus postulum corpus, but also surely with repercussions for that, between metaphysical and transcendental, where he says of a metaphysical exposition and so on, that it is given a priori and then further determined, and of a transcendental elucidation, exposition, and so on, that it is reflecting on an entire system of conditions of possibility to make something possible, although this is possibilized, so to speak, in an a priori manner. So you have two sets of a priori, and you might want to attribute some kind of material a priority to the materialists there that is dogmatic on Kantian standards, and work out a different kind of a priority that is more the a priority of transcendental reasoning. And that also brings in the notion of positing. I think that the connection here to Fichte and to Schelling is quite obvious, but it also could, in the reverse, lead us to a less metaphysically excessive reading of positing in Kant and in Fichte and Schelling, in line with what I just said about the positing as entering something into the space of rendering possible experience and such things. What would you think of these two aspects to more fine-tune the confrontation with materialism here? Transcendental notion against the metaphysical notion and a non-metaphysical conception of positing. Thank you.
Thank you. This is it's a really important distinction. I just now realized that kind of pitted a realism against an idealism, and this wasn't my intention. I mean, what I had in mind was a dogmatism versus transcendentalism, and I think you've really defined this distinction very clearly. This will be important for me to figure into this. I think attributing to Kant a non-metaphysical or a transcendental version of positing in the opus posthumum is a very interesting direction. I do think it's important to kind of detach what happens in the opus, despite how close it sounds to Fichte, to create this distinction, to make this distinction very clear. And I think the description with the two kinds of a priority will help to clarify both the distinction from the new materialism and from the kind of metaphysical axis, as you put it, in the post-Kantian tradition. So very good note, thank you.
Rachel, show yourself or speak up.
Yeah, hi, thank you. That was a really fascinating talk. And like Noam, I don't know the opus posthumum at all. I've never read it. So I'm asking from kind of ignorant point of view. So, but I'm interested. So I guess I have a question about what you think about the changes or the trajectory in Kant's development in his thinking. So it seems to me that in the metaphysical foundations of natural science, like looked at retrospectively from the interpretation you're providing, Kant is already using the body as something affected, as a way of specifying a concept. That is, we have the concept of the object that's given by the categories, and then how do we specify that into material object? We do it by the experience of impermeability of objects, and that is because they touch us. We touch them, they touch us. So already we have this sort of embodied, I don't know, contribution to that specification project. So I wonder if you agree with that view, and then also whether you think that then moving to the aesthetic, which is of course not the same meaning of feeling, transfer, like how to think about that kind of transformation. Maybe it's more continuous, maybe it's like a mistake about what feeling is, whatever. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, thank you. Very good questions that I'm not sure I can answer very intelligently. I think that the notion of feeling does definitely change in this kind of progression. And this is why in the opus it becomes important for him to discuss self-affection. So the idea that somehow we affect ourselves rather than being externally affected is important in how we perceive ourselves as bodies, and that would be, it's a little similar to Schopenhauer. I don't mean to collapse a distinction there, but in the way that how through ourselves we can know something about the in itself. And so we have something of this idea, but he does want to make dense the relationship between the phenomenal and the noumenal in this. And so he turns to a notion of self-affection, or what he calls the appearances of appearances. And I think the distinction you're pointing out between feeling in the aesthetic sense and the feeling in the sense of being touched by a corporeal body is exactly what he's trying to bridge in order to have a more metaphysical conception, a more full philosophical conception of material bodies and bodies in general. Yeah, but I think this bridge is exactly why we find something like this common sense in an idea of an ether, like a community of bodies, suddenly becomes important. Excuse me. Yeah, and I hope that's a good response. It's a very interesting question. I'll have to think about this idea a bit more. Thank you.
Maybe just a short follow-up to Rachel's question. So there's a sort of tendency to read the relationship between the first critique and metaphysical foundations as sort of a top-down specification. And I think one way of understanding Rachel's question, I think at least this is how I hear it, is that we don't necessarily, that's not the only alternative. That's not the only alternative, because when we say that matter is impenetrable, we're already talking about specified matter, right? We know about all kinds of matter, all the kinds of matter we know are impenetrable to some degree or other, right? So in a sense, what you're talking, what really is at stake is the relationship between the empirical and the a priori. But you're not committed to this top-down approach, which I think is sort of pushed on, it's very natural to go that way. And I think a lot of what Kant says seems to suggest this. But I think in the metaphysical foundations, Kant is emphatic that he's talking about an empirical concept, and a very general empirical concept, which presupposes a specification of kinds, or genera and kinds, all of which are impenetrable. And so I think, yeah. So let me just add one more quote, or one more sort of pointer. In the metaphysical foundation, in the metaphysics of morals, Kant has this discussion in the introduction around 218, I think, about the relationship between the empirical and the a priori in moral philosophy. And he says we'll have to take the particular nature of human beings as our object in order to see the a priori in the particular nature of human beings. So it's one place where he seems not to go for this top down, but rather in a way of the a priori and empirical are already intermixed or already conjoined.
Yes, so I think I might have just fallen prey to the top-down idea. I haven't thought to myself, well, maybe the relationship is a little different yet. So thank you for making this explicit, so I can kind of chew on this a little more and see where I land on it. It does seem very natural. I mean, speaking as someone who's fallen prey to it, to read it in this way. I do think that there's still a problem regarding the specificity that you don't get fully resolved in the metaphysical foundations, which is a more empirical concern. I think you're right. The a priori empirical is an important dichotomy here, but it doesn't quite allow me to say why one body is less permeable than another body. This idea of empirical kinds, right, is still kind of an open question. But I do take the point that the impermeability is really important and does make the concept empirical in an important sense that is not given by the top-down approach. So thank you. Yeah.
If no one else has a question, I think we can thank the time in the formal part of our meeting and move smoothly into the informal part after showing our gratitude. Thank you very much for a great talk. This isn't me.
Great. Thanks to the panel. That was really interesting. Two great talks.